Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the RacingNews365.com podcast, looking back at last weekend's Spanish Grand Prix, but also looking forward to this weekend's Austrian Grand Prix. From RacingNews365.com, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm joined, as always, by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Coop. I'm going to keep saying it. And lead editor Ian Parks, who is looking very tranquil, may I say. Gentlemen, let's start with last weekend's Spanish Grand Prix, a great strategic duel between Max and Lando. Max coming out on top in the end. Sam, it was a race of quite a lot of significance. The big question was, are Red Bull going to return to their dominant ways at a circuit which suited or should have suited the RB20? Do you think that is the case? Are Red Bull with the same advantage now that we thought they would have had coming into the weekend?
I think maybe a little less than we thought, especially on one lap pace. We all anticipated the Red Bull would be right at the front again. It's an aerocritical circuit, less about curb riding. It fits more into kind of the overall strength of an F1 car. It will help establish kind of, who's quick generally, in Barcelona. So yeah, I think we expected them to be at the front, or at least Max to be at the front. I should caveat that by saying, but it was a smaller margin than I think many of us were anticipating.
Ian, would you agree on that? Do you think this is a case of actually we have now seen that Red Bull have been caught?
Absolutely. You and I discussed it in quite considerable depth on our F1 update, not only post-qualifying, but post-race as well. The fact that we've now had 3 different pole sitters at the last 3 Grand Prix, and it has not been Max Verstappen, tells you all you need to know with regard to where we now sit, certainly with regard to one lap pace. In Canada, I think we can safely say as well that George Russell was the quickest driver on track. Mercedes definitely looked like they had arguably the quickest car. And in Monaco, you could turn around and say, well, that's quite an anomalous circuit, Monaco. Let's scrub that one out of the way, really, because of the nature of it. So then we come to the weekend and Barcelona's Circuit de Catalunya, where we were all really expecting, all the teams, the rival teams, were fully expecting to Red Bull to return to their level of dominance. And so I think what we saw over the weekend has given all those teams, in particular McLaren, Mercedes and Ferrari, Red Bull's closest rivals right now, serious cause for hope that actually they can take the fight all the way to the very end at every Grand Prix now that's left on the calendar, that Red Bull have most definitely have been caught. Were McLaren the quickest in the race? Arguably, fractionally, yes. Andrea Stella, the McLaren team principal, argued no, they were more on par with one another, and his reasoning for that was simply because of how they had to run their race with regard to their stints. So whilst it looked like Max was definitely quicker at the start, understandable because he managed to clear George Russell on lap 3 very quickly, having been passed off the start, and then Lando looked quickest at the end, it's simply because of the offset that was going on in terms of the strategy. So that's his words, not mine, folks, by the way, just to clarify. Andrea thinks they are actually on par. I think now Austria and Silverstone are most definitely going to give us a clearer indication as to where most certainly McLaren, a fast-charging Mercedes, and a faltering Ferrari that we know has got more in it, are sitting in comparison to Red Bull.
We saw, after Verstappen won, he was actually quite emotional. He jumped out of the car, fists in the air, jumped over the park from a fencing to jump into his engineers and obviously other Red Bull crew. It's something you don't necessarily see very often from Max. Do you think that's a sign that he realises, one, how significant it was to win in Spain, but two, he knows he's actually got a championship fight on his hands?
I think absolutely. And I think it's also important to kind of mention that this is what Max has wanted. He has often said that these kind of procedural, hugely dominant victories that he's been enjoying, because he, to a certain extent, you do enjoy it, obviously, but he has seemingly been craving for this kind of fight. He hasn't had it for a good couple of years, so I think he's relishing it, and I think it makes it more meaningful, or it appears to make it more meaningful for him, and that's exactly what we saw over the weekend. It really feels like a kind of, he's put in a solid shift.
Ian, would you agree on that? Do you think Max thinks he has got a fight on his hands this year?
I don't think he thinks. I think he knows he's got a fight on his hands without a shadow of a doubt. More so than he has had over these past 2 years, because Red Bull, as we know, came out of the box with the introduction, came flying out of the box with the introduction of these new aerodynamic regulations, took them by the scruff of the neck, pretty much as Mercedes did when the 2014 power unit regulations kicked in. And they've dominated. He has dominated. He's been, but in fairness to Max, he's also been a driver a cut above. These past few Grand Prix, certainly the past two, Canada and Spain, we have seen him perform at an extreme level because he is now under more pressure. But that's the mark of a great driver. Not only does he have a great team around him, providing him with the ideal strategy to carry him to these wins that were arguably unexpected in many respects. Certainly Canada was. Don't think many people were expecting Max to come away with a win there, given all we knew about the curb riding and the bumps, and yet he managed to pull a win out of the bag. That was in fairness to strategy, but also due to Max's talent. Similarly, again, having managed to clear Lando Norris from the start, he then saw George Russell whiz around the outside him, and he found himself having to fight his way through. As he said himself in the post-race press conference, he knew he had to clear George very, very quickly, because otherwise he was going to be challenged by Lando very, very soon. The fact that he managed to clear him as quick as he did was one of the keys to his success yesterday. So again, just a supreme level of talent that came to the fore in getting that move done as quickly as he did. And as I say, that was the real platform for a victory that, going into the race, we were unsure might occur because we assumed that McLaren had got the edge. But once again, Max pulled it out of the bag.
On that point, obviously, it was kind of felt like McLaren had the edge going into the race. Lando, obviously, put his hands up himself, was very disappointed in himself after the race because he knew it was a victory loss. His start let him down, and obviously it took too long to get past George Russell, something Max did fairly quickly. A question for both of you, given that we said after Canada that George Russell is a driver who kind of makes mistakes at critical moments when it's leading a race or in pursuit of a podium. Lando, obviously, we've seen him make quite a few mistakes in Q3 over the last 12 months or so, something he's obviously being very self-critical about himself. And obviously we saw him in Catalonia having a poor start. Do we think he's actually, at the moment, got it in him to become a world champion?
Mate,
That's
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Of course he has. Of course he has. This is what he has been building up to over all these years that he's been with McLaren. And you got to think that think back to when Max first started out, when he joined Red Bull, he was criticised for some of the decisions that he made. I can't remember which season it was. I think it might have been his second season with Red Bull in Formula One. So the second season after the first one, when he joined Red Bull after about 5 or 6 Grand Prix from Toro Rosso.
2017 we're talking.
2017?
Yeah.
And he had to be hauled in by then FIA race director Charlie Whiting to discuss his on-track conduct because he was being far too aggressive, making too many mistakes. He was upsetting everybody around him. And I remember Martin Whitmarsh, the then McLaren team principal, describing him as the crash kid. Really harsh comment from Martin, but nevertheless, that was his words again, not mine, simply because of the way Max was driving so erratically then on track. Look at how he has developed over the years into the consummate professional driver he now is, to such a degree, to such a level that I think I mentioned it only recently, that you never see him make a mistake. Yeah. He came under pressure in Canada. He came under pressure in Spain with the way Lando was slowly closing him in on a couple of occasions in stints 2 and towards to the end in stint 3. And he never put a wheel out of place. Actually, he did. I just remembered, actually, he had a slight slidey moment coming out of one of the corners, but supremely rare these days, supremely rare for him to make any kind of little error. But he caught the car, carried on, because I remember him saying over the radio that he had a moment during the race. And this is what's happening with Lando. He's building up that level, and now he's got the car beneath him. In the past, the car's not been there. He struggled with it, just like a lot of drivers struggle with a poor car. And when you struggle with a poor car and you're pushing to the limit, you make mistakes. Now he's got the car beneath him that he trusts, he's got confidence in, and slowly but surely, he's making fewer and fewer mistakes because he's simply building himself up. He's gaining, as I say, that level of confidence, that level of trust, becoming more married to the car. And now he's being able to put in this challenge. But yes, he's still making the odd little error here and there. But that's only because, as I say, he's building himself up.
But in that case, though, sorry, Sam, I'll come to you actually at this point then, given that, Lando is getting better and better race by race, but, because he's developing, still making these very few mistakes, which obviously, unfortunately in Spain, that did cost him the victory. Whereas with Max, obviously, where Max has gone through that developmental phase, he doesn't make those kind of mistakes anymore. Could that be a big difference in whether it's Max or Lando that comes out on top this season? The fact that Max has gone through his development phase, whereas Lando is reaching the end of it, but not quite there yet.
I think absolutely. And I think you've actually kind of teamed me up quite nicely, because I was going to say that.
You're welcome.
You I mean, it's always good when the chemistry, flows between a host and panel. In 2 or 3 times, run that back 2 or 3 times, in the next few races, I don't think Max necessarily gets the win, because Ian points out, about making mistakes, and you're learning, you're building up, you're figuring it out as you go. And the big thing, the real take-home thing for me yesterday was Lando recovered from that initial mistake. More than recovered. The reason why I don't think he won was because McLaren couldn't quite optimize the strategy, in part because they were somewhat dependent on Mercedes' strategy. And, when you could get Lando back out into clean air, and obviously with Lewis being where he was, however many seconds back, they had to pit that second time earlier than they probably would have liked to. So there's other factors, other variables at play as to why Lando didn't win, but I think he did recover really, really well. And just on the kind of the mistakes thing generally as well, George made a really good point, I thought, on Thursday, where he was saying, the reason I'm making more mistakes now is because I'm pushing more. If this was fighting for a championship, I wouldn't do that. In 2022, I wasn't doing that. I was settling into the team. I was, becoming comfortable. Now, I want to go after those race victories. And that's why you're seeing more mistakes, because I'm more on the limit. And it's the same thing with Lando. He himself said as well in Canada that finding that extra thousandth of a second is more motivating. It pushes you on. It spurs you to kind of find that little bit extra. And that's when mistakes come into play. But, F1 drivers have to simultaneously have incredibly long memories and incredibly short memories. You've got to shake off the mistakes, but you've also got to be able to look back at all your learnings over years and years. And Ian, again, was right in saying that you spend your entire life building up to this. And so he's just got that little bit further to go. If this was 6 months later, I think there's a good chance he wins that race.
I watched. I'm just going to chuck this in, Nick. I'm just going to chuck this in because this has actually just sprung to mind. I watched a brilliant clip on LinkedIn the other day, and it was of Roger Federer, and he was receiving some degree or honor at some university, and he was doing this lecture in front of all these people, and he turned around and said that throughout his career, his entire tennis career, and we all know how magnificent that was, he won, I think he said it was about 70% of his matches, or maybe just a fraction more. And then he turned around and said to the people, how many points do you think I won? Bear in mind, he'd won that many amount of matches. How many points throughout his entire career? Someone, God knows how, they totted it all up. He won just 54% of points. And the reason why he made that was such a point, he said, as soon as 1 point had gone, I put it behind me, forgot about it. It was, if I've made a mistake, gone, done. Move on to the next point. That's now the most important. So that's the kind of mindset. I'd love to show Lando that clip, actually. So this is the kind of thing you need to watch for inspiration, Lando, if you need anything like that. But that's the kind of thing that Lando now needs to do because he's very self-critical. He always has been. Andrea Stella mentioned that yesterday as well, post-race. That Lando, that's the kind of guy he is. He's very self-critical. He makes a mistake. He beats himself up. Well, that's the kind of thing that now Lando has to get out of his system. He's got to adopt that kind of Roger Federer kind of mindset and think, I've made a mistake, done, gone, move on, next race or next lap or whatever. So, as I say, I just thought I'd bring that in there because it just came to mind when we were discussing this. So.
Well, it's a good point because obviously, McLaren and Red Bull both have one driver each performing at the top of their game, whereas for both teams on the other side of the garage with Sergio Perez and Oscar Piastri, a very difficult Spanish Grand Prix. Piastri said that it was the first time in his F1 career where he's just struggled across both qualifying and race pace. Sergio Perez called his race a nightmare. Obviously, we've spoken about Perez in detail. Again, though, for both teams, they're kind of in almost similar positions in that there's quite a big gap in lap time being built between their number one and number two drivers, Ian.
Yeah, and we discussed Sergio Perez, as you say, in great detail in the F1 update. And he's a driver that's bereft of confidence right now. It's quite clear. Christian Horner said post-race that Checo is a confidence driver. And right now, quite clearly, he doesn't have it. Whatever's going on with him, and he's obviously trying different things. We discussed that he'd been in the simulator. We discussed that he'd tried multiple setups on the Friday and he couldn't find anything really to his liking. The team are like scratching their heads around him now as well to some degree, because until he gets that race weekend where everything just flows and clicks, until that comes along again, then he's going to be constantly struggling. Right now, Oscar is going through a little bit of a similar thing. Speaking to him in the pen post Grand Prix on Sunday in Barcelona, he said that that's in his Formula One, and it's only short, season and a half, but in his Formula One career so far, that's the least amount of confidence he has had in his McLaren. And that tells you something, because here we are, as you say, we've got two drivers in Lando and Max who are absolutely smashing it in their cars. And we've got two drivers, two teammates in now Oscar and Checo, who have all of a sudden, in Oscar's case, really struggling for confidence. How they go about rediscovering that's going to be a deep dive for the pair of them with their teams. But of course, it's a very short period to deep dive because we've got Austria just around the corner. And then immediately after that, we've got Silverstone. So a huge amount to try and ascertain on both sides for those guys.
Well, and of course, actually, Sam, that's, Austria is a massive race for Red Bull, being their home race. Obviously, more eyes on Perez needing to perform. And then the week after, the British Grand Prix, McLaren's home race. So there'll be even more eyes for that race on Oscar Piastri. There's a lot of pressure on both drivers, clearly, because Max and Lando are doing so well. And obviously in McLaren's case, quite clearly, they've got the best package they have had for many years. Is this a point where we're going to be finding out a significant amount about whether Oscar Piastri does have what it takes to be, one of the biggest stars in Formula One that we all kind of thought he was going to be ahead of his F1 career based on what he did in F2 and F3?
Yeah, I think it is an important period for him. I think also he'll probably be quite pleased it's a triple header, because you've just got to get back on the horse, get back in the car, and you just need to switch off, not think. As soon as you start thinking with any sport, I remember there was a basketball player who was saying that he would always say to an opponent, "Oh, yeah, that moved just a minute ago. How did you do that?" And as soon as you're thinking about it, as soon as you're aware, you're not at your capacity. And that's something, Alex Albon has talked about a lot in the past, about thinking and, kind of, you've just got to be in that flow state. So for Piastri, I think that will actually help him. The fact that he just has to keep going now for the next 2 weekends. We knew that this slump would come at some point. It always does, inevitably. It's the second year, sophomore slump, whatever it might, whatever you want to call it.
Sophomore slump.
Yeah,
like
because it's all.
For anybody that
think,
wants to look up the word sophomore, it means second year.
Yeah.
So
yes,
for our non-American audience.
I did try and signpost that by saying second year slump as well. But I think for Oscar, I think he's having a bit of a comeback down to earth, because he is, whereas Lando's more pessimistic, Oscar feels to be more optimistic. And over the last few weeks, and Ian will agree, Oscar's been very I feel really confident. I think the car's going to be good wherever we go. And this weekend has knocked him. And I think it's knocked him because he almost wasn't expecting it. He wasn't ready for that. Whereas Lando is a few years further into his career. He knows that you can just lose it over a weekend. It can just get away from you. And that's what seemingly happened in Spain, is it was just one of those horrible weekends for him. How he responds is going to be really, really key, but he needs to learn to kind of just brush that off, just get over it and get on with it. Perez, I think, is an entirely different thing. This is a pattern that is now over a number of years. Yes, Lando has taken a step recently, and Oscar, and he's regrown that delta between him and Oscar, which Oscar had closed over the last part of last season and the early part of this season to a certain degree. But Verstappen is a known commodity to Perez. He has been at this level for a long time. And if anything, we're actually seeing more of that because he's having to fight more. But Perez is he isn't in a position to respond. He has these difficulties mid-season in the European season. We've seen it in the past. And now that things are closer, he hasn't got that extra few tenths in his pocket. We saw in qualifying, Lando and Max were right there. You're within 200th of a second from each other. Then 3/10 of a second back, you've got the Mercedes. Perez was out-qualified by Pierre Gasly in an Alpine. And yes, then further insult to injury, his 3-place penalty. So that, for me, is a much more worrying thing. I think for Oscar, it's just part of the growing pains. Every driver goes through it. But Perez, he's been in F1 for over a decade now. This is part of his DNA as a driver.
The thing that was really staggering as well in Sergio's case is that, okay, yes, he completed a 3-stop strategy, whereas obviously Max was on a 2-stop. Okay, Perez was still 59 seconds behind Max in a race. Even if you take away that pit stop, you're still looking at around the 30-second mark, which for a team that are wanting to be winning both championships, that's a massive margin to be behind. But I think, for those who are watching on YouTube, let us know your thoughts on both Oscar and Sergio, because they're very interesting situations, and it'll be great to see obviously how those stories develop over the remaining 2 races of the triple header. Let's move away though from Red Bull and McLaren. But before we do so, for those who are watching our RacingNews365.com videos, we have our latest prize giveaway starting on Wednesday. If you want to win a scale model F1 car of your favourite team or driver, then be sure to be subscribed to the RacingNews365.com YouTube channel. That is how you enter, and we will at random select some winners. Okay, let's let's talk about Lewis Hamilton, because after 13 races, he was finally back on the podium for the 198th time in his F1 career. It's been a long time since seeing him on the podium. He quite literally took a nap, it seemed, on the press conference sofa afterwards. The age is getting to him a little bit, but for his confidence, and that's a big thing going to the second half of the season, and obviously his final few bumps with Mercedes.
It's a big thing as well when you consider everything that came out last week with regard to this email scandal, which we didn't really touch on the F1 update over the weekend. It all came to light at the back end of last week in Barcelona, though, when when Lewis was asked about it initially, and then Toto Wolff also commented on it. And it's an email that was sent to all the team principals, all the senior figures within F1 and FIA, all the permanent pass holders within the F1 media, of which I am one. Basically, it was the same email group that received the Christian Horner document earlier in the season when all that was flying around. And it was a very short email. It came from a very unusual email address, something I deleted straight away because I thought it was spam. And only after I realized what was going on did I actually go back into it and read it. And basically, it was saying that Lewis was being... there was an unevenness with regard to the treatment of George and Lewis on the Mercedes side of the garage, to such an extent that they were suggesting that Lewis's safety was being compromised. They suggested it was a cold tyre strategy. We did write a story in the end on Racing News 365. If you want to go in and find that, I did sub the email contents down to what I felt was acceptable to add in, but nevertheless you are getting a very good version of events. It was all dismissed by Mercedes, it was all dismissed by Lewis, but nevertheless that seed has been planted to suggest that somebody within Mercedes had sent out this email and was trying to paint a picture as to what was going on inside the team, that Lewis, in deciding to leave Mercedes after all these years and join Ferrari, as he will be doing for next season, was being, as I say, treated now differently to the way George is being looked after this term. It's something, as I say, that was dismissed by Lewis, dismissed by George, dismissed quite categorically by Toto Wolff, in no uncertain terms, describing the person that wrote this kind of email as a lunatic. They needed to see a shrink, etc., etc. Toto was quite adamant following that result for Lewis, his first podium since Mexico last year, that now will hopefully finally silence the brainless, pretty much to use his word. Basically said they've got no brains, these kind of people that were writing this kind of stuff, would finally silence those kind of critics. And you would hope that this now has filled Lewis with a degree of confidence, because finally, all too often, he'd come out of a Friday practice and he'd say, yeah, car feels great, I'm doing really well. And then the car had just completely turned post-qualifying. And that was obviously what has also helped fuel this fire around this email that was sent out, that perhaps there was an intimation on Lewis's side that what was going on here, this is something very different. How can my car feel so good on Friday, but then not so good on a Saturday? And I'm down the grid compared to where George is. So finally we see over this past weekend that he had a car to fight with. He's now feeling a lot more comfortable with it. And he got the podium that he truly deserved. He, like Lando, admitted that he also made a mistake off the line. And he too could have arguably done a degree better, although in fairness, third was probably the best he could have achieved, bearing in mind the performance of Max and Lando in front of him. But going forward, you would assume now that both he and George will be given equal treatment, if that wasn't the case before and that email did actually shed a degree of light on something that was perhaps untoward going on.
Definitely. And Sam, given the podium finish, and obviously it's the first time since Miami, I believe, that Lewis has finished ahead of George. Does this put him back on track a little bit?
I think so. I think it puts to bed some of the doubts. And I'm not necessarily talking about the anonymous email. I think there's been a lot of speculation in the early part of the year. Has Lewis still got it? Is the motivation there? Has he kind of phoned this season in a little bit? Is he just kind of waiting to move to Ferrari now? I think it puts some of that to rest. And I mean, these are incredibly motivated people. To get to that level of anything in your life, you have to be, almost incomprehensibly motivated. So the idea that this high-level athlete, one of the most successful athletes of all time, would just switch off is, a bit odd. But I think it's put to rest that kind of assumption. And I think he needed it. I think he really did. I think there was he was searching for something a little bit, and I think he was trying to find it in the car. I think he was trying to, as we've seen throughout the contemporary ground effect era, he's been the one to try and work that out for Mercedes. He said, you know what, George is new in the team. He needs to find his feet. He's less experienced. I'm the one who should be experimenting more with strategy. And we've seen it throughout those 2.5 years because of the change in philosophy in the Mercedes cars and so on and so forth. So there's a continuation of that. But he has looked more confident since Monaco. I think Monaco was the kind of that key turning point for the team generally. Yes, he didn't have the front wing, but he looked, not a great qualifying for him in Canada, but he looked very strong in the race to converge with George. And I think it's a natural progression of that we're now seeing. So I think he will be more in form into the summer, and I mean, form's part of it as well. Drivers go through lean periods. That is partly it as well. So there's a multitude of factors that have all kind of come together to give him a less than ideal start to the season. But again, this is the most decorated F1 driver in history. He has all the tools at his disposal to get back into that form, and that's what we're now seeing, I think.
And just very quickly before we move on to Ferrari, looking ahead to Austria, how important do we think it is, Ian, for Lewis to, back up a very positive Spanish Grand Prix with a very good Austrian Grand Prix, given that the week after it's the big one for him? It's the race at Silverstone.
He will now want to be absolute pedal to the metal, shall we say, because now he appreciates that he has a good car again underneath him, one he knows he can push, one he knows he can finally again trust in. We do still have to temper expectations to a degree, because both he and Toto Wolff recognise that they are still a step, albeit a smaller one than it has been at any time over the course of this season, a step behind both Lando in the McLaren and Max in the Red Bull. Both George and Lewis, after qualifying, after finishing 0.3 adrift of the front two, both said that there was probably another 0.2 they could have found within the car to be, let's say, a tenth behind rather than the 3. So that gives you an idea as to how close Mercedes are, if those comments are to be believed. And we know full well that given the trajectory that Mercedes has been on with regard to its developments and its rate of development as well, it has been constantly adding parts to that car for quite a number of Grand Prix now. We can only assume that they are, in fact, going to continue to get ever closer. I asked Toto specifically after the Grand Prix, do you feel that at some stage you will get a race win because of that rate of development, and knowing as well you have got other developments coming? And he's basically, bottom line, yes, they are confident that they can get a race win at some point this season. When that will be, hard to say. Let's not rush too much by saying it's going to be Austria or even Silverstone, but at least now Mercedes, Lewis and George know they have a car that's going to be able to push Lando in the McLaren and Max in the Red Bull in particular, all the way to the line in terms of qualifying and to the checkered flag with regard to the race.
Absolutely. Now, let's move on to the team that Hamilton is joining next year. Ferrari, the team who have kind of left us all scratching our heads after the Spanish Grand Prix. We kind of dismissed the Canadian Grand Prix as just, a one-off, blip, as every team endures during this season. However, Ferrari have backed up their Canadian Grand Prix blip with another sort of blip in Spain, and on top of that as well, a small piece of contact between Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz in the opening stages of the race. Both drivers with some very heated words for one another afterwards. Sam, I don't want to use the word feud because that seems potentially a bit much, but it does feel like away from the circuit, they're very much, we get on really, really well. Everything's going amazing. But there's a couple of times now we've seen the pair having these little incidents happening on circuit. And this time it did result in minor contact.
It did. I mean, they certainly spiced up what would be an otherwise tepid weekend for Ferrari. So there's, we can thank them at least for that. I think it's almost like the frustration of the last couple of rounds is starting to show. All these things that usually they've been very, very PR'd in their approach to we'll discuss it internally. These things happen, et cetera, exactly what you'd expect them to say. But for Carlos to kind of be like, he's always, complaining about something. Like, it just seems a bit like, kind of soap opera-esque. And for then Charles to be like, well, if I was in his position, almost like it was a bit catty. And we don't really kind of see that often from teammates. So, yeah, I mean, enjoy it, grab the popcorn and make the most of it while it's still happening. But yeah, no doubt in Austria, they'll be on the best of behaviour, having had a clip around the ear over this week. I think it is the frustration showing. I think from Charles' side, he's going, he's been really aggressive. It's his home race. He kind of feels like he has something to prove. Maybe, I don't know. Obviously can't assume. And then from Carlos' side, I think is it 2.5 years, 4 years? God, how long's Carlos been at Ferrari now? And Charles is the chosen son. It must be difficult being the other son in that kind of fable or parable. So I think that's what's starting to kind of show a little bit. But yeah, they'll sort out internally. It'll be fine. I think it's ultimately they probably weren't expecting to be fighting for 5th and 6th. And that is, I'm sure, a big disappointment for them.
And Ian, the thing that's, I guess, kind of interesting about the whole thing is that then a couple of hours after the race, we found out some news that there's another team now interested in Carlos Sainz's services. Alpine, on the weekend where they announced the return of Flavio Briatore, it seems he's already doing some work for them ahead of 2025.
From what we understand, talks have so far been very promising, quite advanced. We already knew that Williams most definitely were courting Carlos. James Vowles, over the course of the Canadian Grand Prix weekend, made quite clear he was their number one choice to replace Logan Sargent. We also were aware that Audi, of course, had been courting Carlos for quite some period. They're wanting him to be alongside Nico Hülkenberg for the stake Audi team. Stake next year, of course, Audi from 2026, when the German manufacturing giant finally enters Formula One for the first time. And now here we are, Alpine has all of a sudden entered the fray. Not long after, of course, deciding that they no longer wanted the services of Esteban Ocon. That was announced after the Monaco Grand Prix, and we're all aware, of course, what happened in Monaco between him and Pierre. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, effectively, for the Alpine management, and them deciding to get rid of that particular Frenchman. So no real surprise, to my mind, that Carlos, being the most experienced in terms of with whom he's driven, one of the most experienced, given his talent where he's driven, given his performances in recent times with Ferrari, is now come to the fore in the minds of the Alpine management. Of course, it's another one of those for him to weigh up because, as we've discussed previously, with Williams, it's a known quantity. They've got the Mercedes engine. They're on what appears to be this upward trajectory under James Vowles, but how quickly is it going to hit the front, if it can at all?
Yeah.
With Alpine, another different type of, with Audi, another different type of package, brand new into Formula One. How long is it going to take them to hit the front? With Alpine, we are now led to believe that they are going to ditch, or Renault is going to pull out a Formula One power unit supplier. And so Alpine will require a new power unit partner from 2026 onwards. So again, all these things will be going on inside of Carlos's mind. And I would not want to be in his shoes in terms of making this decision, because it's a case of, who does he go for? Does he go for Williams? Does he go for Audi? Does he go for Alpine? But it's one of those that no one knows right now. Not even Max Verstappen at Red Bull knows, if he stays there for 2026, and that's another can of worms you could open there. Who is going to be the quickest in that particular season, and then going forwards as to who might dominate with their power unit for the first 2 or 3 years? Or is it just going to be a real mix of power unit suppliers turning it on at different times? It's a fascinating picture for Carlos, and as I say, a real dilemma for him. I wouldn't want to be in his shoes on one hand in terms of having to make that particular dilemma, because of course it doesn't matter who he goes to, he's going to be a very handsomely paid man.
And also, I guess the thing to consider as well is that really he's got to be thinking about the best option for 2026 rather than 2025, because realistically, all three of those teams are not going to be fighting for podiums or victories next year. Very interesting stuff. But let's get on quickly to some fan questions, because we've had loads sent in by our audience. So first things first, I'll come to you, Ian. This is a question from Nolago, and apologies if I pronounce any of these names wrong. If Mercedes continue to improve, will Lewis Hamilton regret joining Ferrari?
Oh, I knew this one was coming because we discussed it pre-podcast, and I almost threw it into our conversation about Lewis, and I was going to turn around and say, Nick, I do believe you've got a fan question about Lewis, but here we go. We brought it into the mix towards the end. Great question. Fabulous question, that one. If Mercedes continues on this trajectory, as I've discussed earlier, if it does eventually come into the win equation category, as again I discussed earlier, as Toto Wolff believes will happen, then Lewis, surely somewhere in the back of his mind there will be a degree of, have I done the right thing? It would be inevitable. It's human nature to consider that kind of question. Knowing the kind of person that Lewis is, however, I would suggest that that is something that would enter his consciousness for a short period of time, and he would very quickly dismiss it, simply because he is in the Roger Federer kind of mode of, okay, I've done that, I've achieved that, or I didn't achieve that, or that happened, or whatever, and he just moves on. That's the kind of person Lewis is. And so I know, as I say, as best as I possibly can, and I've known Lewis for quite some time, going back to his first year in Formula One back in 2007. So I've got a good idea as to the kind of person that he is. He will very quickly move on as soon as his Ferrari, this McLaren, oh, good grief. As soon as this Mercedes season is done, and very quickly switches attention to Ferrari.
And of course, as well, racing for Ferrari, as you kind of mentioned, it's something he's never done before. It's a fresh opportunity. So, yeah, very interesting points, and an amazing question as well. Sam, we'll come to you next. A question from Trishla. And I don't actually know the answer to this, so I'm quite intrigued. Why is the fastest lap points only given if you finish in the top 10?
So aside from it being enshrined in the regulations, I believe that it will probably be to do with something like they don't want the drivers who are 11th down through to 20th, if still running, to all dive into the pits and all be fighting for it at the end of the race. And I think there's an element of, to protect the sanctity of the point scorers, you have to be a point scorer to unlock that fastest lap. There may well be other racing consequences that I haven't thought of off the top of my head, that would be a safety concern or some kind of sporting integrity. So yeah, it's something, I'll look into it and I'll get back to you with a fuller answer. But that is also a great question because yeah, it would make, as Nick, you kind of pointed out before we recorded, it would make it interesting at the end of the race. It would give those guys something to fight for, a little kind of like one lap dash.
I want to see 8 pit stops being made on the penultimate lap. It'd be brilliant fun. Ian, we'll come to you next. And these questions are amazing, by the way. This one comes from Miguel. Would Lando have won if he had new softs for the final stint? Of course, at the start of the race, Lando started on fresh softs. Max started on used softs. And obviously for the final stint, it was the flip reversal. Max fitted a set of new softs. Lando went for a set of old softs because that's all he had available. But let's say he did have another set of fresh softs available. Do you think that would have been the difference maker to allow him to have caught Max and also then potentially overtaken him for the win?
No, I don't think so. There would have been certainly an advantage in coming straight out of the pits and on a fresh set of softs, that without a shadow of a doubt. And those lap times would have been marginally better than what he was putting in. But I don't think there would have been enough in it or in them at the end of the day for him to have got up to the back of Max and without a doubt then doing the really difficult hard part of actually overtaking, particularly around that circuit, even though it has improved marginally over the years with the removal of that final chicane to aid the overtaking cause. But I really don't think he would have had an opportunity to have done that.
Very interesting. And final question for you, Sam. I'll throw it to you. From Herman, is Max Verstappen just that good, or is the car carrying him? This person, Herman, thinks that Red Bull are now the second fastest team.
That's a very good question. It's something that's a very moving target. It's a movable target, that because obviously the nature of the calendar, you go race to race in very different venues. I would. My instinct says that Red Bull is still the best car on balance, as in on not on balance, as in the technical side of F1, but like the saying. I do think Max Verstappen is a difference maker, though. Absolutely, I think what you see with Max is, and don't get me wrong, Sergio Perez is a very good racing driver. But for the difference there with Max is huge in racing terms, and I think that shows just that X factor he has. And yeah, he's arguably his X factor in his ability to get something out of a car that others couldn't is more pronounced than I think we've ever really seen from Lewis. And that's maybe a big claim, but yeah, I think Max does have the difference there because, as we've seen, if you put another driver in that car, I think it becomes much closer.
Definitely. Nola, Trishla, Miguel and Herman, thank you very much for what were 4 brilliant questions. Now, just to very quickly finish this episode of the podcast, we need not only a takeaway from the Spanish Grand Prix, but a rapid, bold prediction for the Austrian Grand Prix. I'll give you 2 about 5 seconds to think. I'll go first. My biggest takeaway was I think Mercedes are back and they will win a race this season. In terms of a bold prediction for the Austrian Grand Prix, I'm going to say an Oscar Piastri podium. Sam, your turn.
So I'd like to point out also that if you take Lando Norris out of the equation, my prediction was right for this weekend. That, yeah, it was Max minus Lando, Lewis and George. But anyway, so my take home from the weekend is that...
Therefore, it was wrong, basically.
Yeah, it's wrong. So you can't just take away driver. Okay, Sam.
You can't just take Lando out of the equation.
I was going to say.
My prediction's right. Yeah, brilliant.
The expression clutching at straws comes to mind, but, you've got to take the half wins when you can. It's a game of numbers, this is. My big take home was what we're increasingly seeing is cars seemingly develop backwards. It's almost getting into this negative growth where, we saw with the RB, they were like, we've been, brought extensive, kind of changes to the floor, the aero package, and they were absolutely nowhere in almost a similar way that we've seen with Red Bull. So my big take home is that it's almost the more we know about these cars, the less we do. And that's, I think, because as we're riding lower to the floor, that critical difference where Red Bull had a really big advantage and through kind of a downstream osmosis-like effect, RB did as well. As the aero evolves, actually what they thought they knew isn't necessarily the case. So my big take home is that, we've seen Aston Martin as well really struggle with development, Haas in the past, that we're seeing backwards development more and more than we used to. And my prediction for the Australian Grand Prix,
it's definitely not Australian. We've done that one. I slept through it.
I'd like to get my prediction in very early for the Australian Grand Prix. No, for the Austrian Grand Prix. I mean, aside from the fact it's going to be very, very close because it is the shortest or the smallest lap time of the year. It's like, 63, 64 seconds. I think the top 5 guys on the grid are all going to be different cars.
Interesting. Ian, bring us home.
Takeaway. It's actually, my takeaway is a team we've actually not discussed in this podcast, and that's Aston Martin, and just how much trouble that team is actually in. Speaking to Mike Crack post-race, he drew on the fact, we scored a good chunk of points in Canada. A good chunk of points because Canada's a very anomalous circuit. And Barcelona, as we know, is that barometer for any team as to where it actually stands and as to what we can expect from it going forward. What we are witnessing right now is a team in quite considerable amount of turmoil with regards to its development. You almost get the impression that it doesn't quite know which way to turn with that car. Mike confirmed that there are going to be upgrades on it. There are a considerable amount of upgrades. Fernando has said that he's looking forward to them. But what can we expect from Aston Martin? This is a team that has, with its owner, Lawrence Stroll, and the consortium behind him, invested huge amounts of money. Factory, wind tunnel, drivers, personnel. They're talking to Adrian Newey now, and the rumoured contract number is alleged to be $25 million a year. Quite staggering amount of money, if that's to be believed. And that wasn't the starting point of the negotiations. They've actually come down from the original figure, from what I'm led to believe. So they are throwing huge amounts of money at that team, and here we are. Despite its good start to last season, it has basically struggled over the course of the past year. Picked up a point here and there, but it really now needs to start proving itself. Given the hopes and aspirations of Lawrence when he turned around and said that he wanted that team to be winning races and championships within about 5 years. Well, I think here we are in year 4 of that program. And right now, that is a team that looks nowhere near landing a podium place, never mind scoring a Grand Prix victory. And in many respects, as we saw across Spain, can't even grab a point. So it's a real tough period that they're going through, and as I say, they really have to start showing themselves. So that's the big takeaway for me with regard to Austria this weekend. I'm absolutely going to go for a Lando Norris victory. It's a circuit that he loves. He's proven that in the past. He said it himself post Spain as well, that these next 2 circuits are 2 of his favourites. So I am fully expecting for him to don the Roger Federer mantle, to quickly dismiss what occurred across Spain, to banish that from his mind, and to come out all guns blazing around the Spielberg Red Bull Ring circuit and come away with that Grand Prix victory.
Based on your takeaway, I thought you were going to say an Aston Martin podium. But anyways, good, good stuff as always. For those who have been watching this podcast on YouTube, be sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel to be included in the prize giveaway, and also keep an eye out on Wednesday for part 2 of our exclusive documentary into young Moto 3 rider Colin Wyatt. And if you've missed part 1, you can also find that on our YouTube channel. This has been the latest episode of the Racing News 365.com podcast from Ian, Sam, and myself. We'll see you this weekend for the Austrian Grand Prix. See you later.
And as always, take care.
Bye.